This is the Tribal Drinking Water State of the Data launch webinar. And we'll just give it one more minute and then we'll get started. But thank you all for being here. Okay, awesome. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. Thank you all so much for being here. Gunas Chish. I'm Sydney. I am EPIC's Tribal Legal Fellow and a Think It Tribal Citizen. And I'll be walking y'all through our Tribal Drinking Water State of the Data project today. So this project really was born out of a vision that tribal communities should have access to safe, reliable, and affordable drinking water. But the statistics on tribal drinking water access, as I'm sure many of y'all know, are dire. Nearly 50% of tribal homes on tribal lands lack access to reliable water resources, compared to 1% of US homes overall. But what we found in this evaluation is that number only tells a piece of the story. Our investigation uncovered a tribal drinking water gap. If we can't identify the drinking water access challenge, we can't solve it. But our research also uncovered that we have the tools to bridge the gap and we just have to do it. So today we're going to be walking y'all through our project background and orientation, some of our findings in the federal data set evaluation, a literature review, and in tribal data sovereignty. And then we're going to talk through some strategies for improving these data. Today we'll be hearing from Corey Elian. Corey is an enrolled Hoopa tribal member with Yurok, Karuk, Ute, and Blackfoot descendancy, and is a project director at Native Americans in Philanthropy. And she previously was the deputy executive director at the Yurok tribe and is a nationally recognized leader in environmental health and protection. And we're really excited to have her here. And then we've also got Emily Tsai, who is a data scientist at EPIC, and Jesse Marr, who is the director of technology at EPIC, on board. So if y'all have any questions in the chat, they'll be responding to those. So this project really began when EPA released their first service area boundaries data set in 2024. This is the first data set that really allows us to tie a community to the water system that serves them. And is a much better way to understand who is served by which water than kind of a proxy who lives in the area of a water system. We wanted to use this data set to understand what this could tell us about tribal drinking water access, but soon we realized just how complicated this question was. So there's a lot of different ways, things that we mean when we say tribal drinking water access. So we can kind of break this down to just get into how complicated this question is. When you say tribal, who are you talking about? Are you talking about tribal citizens who live on tribal lands? Are you talking about tribal citizens regardless of where they live? Are you talking about anyone who lives on tribal land? And when we say tribal lands, what do we mean? Do we mean reservation land, fee land, allotted land, or the US government's definition of Indian country? When we talk about drinking water, do we mean public water systems? And if we do mean public water systems, which of those three public water systems do we mean? Community water systems, non-transient, non-community, or transient, non-community water systems, or do we mean private, unregulated wells? And when we talk about access, what does that mean? For the purposes of this project, what we really meant was where and how do people get their water? Is it safe? Is it reliable and affordable? But for this project, we're really looking at the ways that these different federal data sets might capture kind of any combination of these elements. So here's what we did. To do this project, first, we evaluated the implementation of federal drinking water programs on tribal lands. So that was mainly the Safe Drinking Water Act and the Sanitation Facilities Construction Program, because we know that tribal sovereignty means that tribes have different policy levers than non-tribal communities to address tribal drinking water challenges. We also dug into the publicly available national drinking water data that's published by EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, and IHS, Indian Health Service, to understand how they can be used to capture tribal drinking water access and quality. We reviewed research on tribal drinking water to understand how the limitations of these federal data sets impact research and policy conclusions. And we really used a data sovereignty lens to understand and develop opportunities to improve the drinking water data according to tribal priorities. So just to get oriented, we're going to do a very quick crash course. The federal government has a trust responsibility to provide tribal citizens with for the public health of tribal citizens by ensuring access to safe, reliable, and affordable drinking water. We've already talked about the complexity of kind of defining the tribal drinking water access question, but another layer is that tribal sovereignty means that tribes possess the inherent right to govern and make and enforce laws. Sovereignty can be limited only by treaty with the United States, by congressional action, or by court rulings when there's inconsistency with federal law. There are at least 7 federal agencies that support tribal drinking water infrastructure projects, and each has dozens of programs. But only Indian Health Service and EPA collect and report data on tribal drinking water needs. EPA is authorized to do that by the Safe Drinking Water Act, and they maintain their data in the Safe Drinking Water Information System, or SIDWIS. Congress has also provided tribes with the authority to implement environmental regulations on tribal lands, something called primacy. If tribes choose not to exercise that authority, then the EPA, not the state, directly implements SIDWA in Indian country. Indian Health Service implements the trust responsibility to the Sanitation Facilities and Construction Program. I'm so sorry, I forgot to change slides. To the Sanitation Facilities and Construction Program, and maintains the data necessary to carry out that program in their Sanitation Tracking and Reporting System, or STARS. So despite all of these provisions for tribal drinking water, IHS is consistently underfunded. In 2020, they were funded at 6% of what was needed. But under the infrastructure bill, they were funded for the first time at full need from 2022 to 2026. And then also the Safe Drinking Water Act didn't include tribes for about a decade. Tribes were left out of the influx of funding that came with the Safe Drinking Water Act and have been playing catch up ever since. And so that really bears out today in severe drinking water access gaps and in omissions from the data that we found. So now I'm just going to go to Corey. Corey, as I shared before, is the former deputy executive director for the Yurok tribe, and is a leader in environmental health. And so she's joined us to speak a little bit about the importance of tribal drinking water data in her work there. Thank you so much, Corey.
Well, Klaus, Sydney, thank you so much. And thank you all for joining us for this important discussion today. Drinking water data is really important to tribes, and the tribes that have drinking water systems know the complexity of the access to that data and, of course, storing that data. So the Yurok tribe has remote and rural communities spread out across a very rugged landscape, many of which historically lack centralized water systems or face contamination risk from upstream activities like illegal cannabis operations. The fractured lands that tribes face result in the need for multiple water systems. This creates a hardship, as you've mentioned, Sydney, for tribes to sustain work due to the lack of funding available. Many rural tribal communities have limited talent and capacity available, often resulting in 1 or 2 people keeping multiple unconnected systems in compliance. In addition, tribal authorities may not have equitable access to certified laboratories. For example, up here in the Pacific Northwest, Northern California to be exact, the Hupa, Yurok, and Karuk tribes need to drive hours away to submit water quality samples required by the Safe Drinking Water Act. This creates another layer of complexity for tribal drinking water systems. The parfait of hoops tribes must jump through is usually the driving factor for allowing IHS to manage their water systems, which does not allow tribes to exert a true self-governance. Drinking water data is essential for 3 main reasons: health protection, system planning and upgrades, advocacy, and sovereignty. Tribes like the Yurok tribe face significant barriers to accessing and controlling their own data. The fragmented reporting systems that tribal water systems face rely on the EPA for oversight and not necessarily state agencies, which can limit access to the centralized data platforms like the SDWIS. The capacity limitations that many tribal programs are facing exist due to underfunded and understaffed components of a drinking water system. Without the dedicated technical staff or data systems, it's very difficult to collect, interpret, and use the data effectively. In addition to these two barriers, the lack of inclusion in national assessments really make it invisible for tribes to access those funding. So those data sets, if they don't exist, how can they be funded? So I think a call to action for me today would really highlight the need to move forward in a good way where tribes have equitable access to data tools and the ability to own and govern their data and sustain their investment in tribal drinking water workforce development. Back to you, Sydney.
And thank you, Corey. I think that's really helpful and a great illustration of why this is so important. So thank you. All right, so now we can kind of get into what we found when we dug into these data sets. So first we looked at EPA's Safe Drinking Water Information System. So the first kind of limitation with CIDWIS is that this data set captures only the data that falls within EPA's regulatory scope. It only captures public water systems and not unregulated wells. EPA CIDWIS also uses the Indian country filter to tag and identify drinking water systems that serve Indian country. This is the best and most convenient proxy for understanding drinking water data on tribal lands if you're looking at a national data set, but its convenience can hide the systems that it doesn't include. Those can be systems that are inaccurately entered into the CIDWIS systems, or those that serve tribal lands that don't fall under the federal definition of Indian country. We'll get into this in a little. And then it also doesn't include the geographies that tribes are interested in. The definitions and data caveats also that relate to these tribal filters are ambiguous, and data limitation descriptions could be more robust, particularly considering the jurisdictional complexity of the drinking water data landscape. There are limitations, but it's really hard for data users to discern them. When we look at the EPA service area boundaries data set, we found that the data set kind of purports to include tribes, but it doesn't give an adequate description of the pretty severe limitations that are reflected in the tribal service area boundaries data. So first, the data set was created and validated in a way that did not include tribes. The data was either reported by states. This was the gold standard of data in creating this data set, and tribes don't necessarily or typically share their service area boundaries data with states, or data was modeled using the state reported data. So basically, the models weren't based on data that included tribes, and none of the gold standard data that's in there includes tribal service area boundaries data. And then the data limitations that already exist in this data set, like it's harder to model service area boundaries in rural systems, disproportionately impact tribal communities. And then in terms of the Indian Health Service data, this is actually considered to be the best available tribal drinking water access data. So this reflects tribal drinking water and sanitation infrastructure access at the household level for individual tribal households within and outside of Indian country, according to a kind of specific geography of that IHS uses, but you can read about that in our report. It's totally confidential to IHS and tribal staff, plus is shared kind of with limited access to other agency staff to help them with planning and kind of program coordination. And then the only publicly available way that we can see this data is in reports to Congress that IHS produces annually. So I think this is good for tribal data sovereignty, right? This is to keep this data confidential. It's highly sensitive information, it's household level, but also it kind of limits the usefulness of this data. It's really only used for project planning and appropriations. All right, so we can kind of get into what this means. So the kind of takeaway from all of that is that the federal data sets exist to meet federal priorities and not tribal priorities. This has implications for research and policy recommendations, but the two graphics on the left kind of illustrate the geography that EPA cares about and the geography that IHS cares about. Again, you can read more about that in our report. And the illustration on the right illustrates more of what a tribal leader might care about when addressing and evaluating drinking water access and quality. So this includes places outside of formally federally recognized tribal lands where tribal citizens live, work, attend school, hunt, fish, or exercise treaty rights or have ceremonies, basically anywhere tribal citizens might be drinking water. Another tribal drinking water operator expressed to us the importance of having an understanding of drinking water quality and access throughout their watershed, particularly given the increasing prevalence of PFAS in water sources and for climate change resilience planning. So this is kind of the data gap. But where do we go from here? And I think Corey was really helpful in bringing up tribal data sovereignty as the way forward. So a growing Indigenous data sovereignty movement calls for Indigenous people's right to govern the collection, ownership, and application of their data, which is grounded in tribes' inherent right to self-govern. This is really a response to the historic misuse by researchers and by the federal government of Indigenous people's data. And tribal data sovereignty can kind of include tribal laws to protect people and land through research guidelines and through tribal policy, the establishment of tribal IRBs. It includes collaborative research that's aligned with tribal protections. It includes calls for the federal government to share data back with tribes that tribes have reported, an end to what's called the one-way data highway. And most crucially, it includes tribal control of data. So an evaluation of US population data on tribal communities found that these US population data are, quote, often inconsistent, irrelevant, and of poor quality, and that the data are, quote, produced and used within an environment of mistrust and controlled by those external to Native nations, but tribal leaders are still forced to depend on these data for decision-making. Indigenous data sovereignty researchers assert that data is a strategic resource for the exercise of tribal self-determination. Basically, to solve drinking water access problems, tribes need to exercise self-determination, and that includes over their data. So we can get into this example of data as a strategic resource. I just want to start by saying every tribe is unique. There are 574 individual federally recognized tribes in the United States, plus many more that do not have federal recognition. And if you know one tribe, you know one tribe, which is why tribal data sovereignty is so important. But I think the Passamaquoddy tribe of Sapaic's fight to address their drinking water concerns can kind of illustrate what we've been talking about today. They've been facing a drinking water crisis and dealing with toxic drinking water since the 1980s. The tribal government was unable to exert their sovereignty to address the crisis because of a deal under the Maine Indian Claims Settlement Act. In Maine, reservations are treated like municipalities. Maine had the authority to regulate drinking water standards on tribal lands instead of the EPA for the tribe, which is not true anywhere else in the country. Tribes were unable to make use of natural resources located on tribal lands without getting state and municipal approval, including of alternate drinking water resources. For example, neighboring municipalities use their well construction approval processes to block the tribe's attempt to build a well to serve the tribal school on tribal lands, where for years students had been disallowed from drinking piped water and had been drinking only bottled water. And the utility that serves the reservation is excluded from the statewide tax exemption that applies to all other water utilities in Maine. So there are also implications in CIDWIS for this. Because the Maine reservations are treated like municipalities, they don't include the Indian country identifier in EPA's CIDWIS, and thus wouldn't be included in any research where a researcher relied on the Indian country identifier, which is the best proxy in that data set to understand drinking water on tribal lands. So no research, no policy recommendations were including or even highlighting the situation going on with the Passamaquoddy. So despite these conditions, regulators were insisting that the water was safe to drink. The tribe knew it wasn't, and that wasn't what was coming out of their tap. What was coming out of their tap was not safe. So in 2019, the tribe applied for and won EPA funding to test local drinking water themselves through a community monitoring initiative, and to begin an engagement effort to create a community action plan to improve water quality. That plan and the accompanying data after decades of tribal advocacy resulted in a legislative fix that was signed into law in 2022 by the Maine legislature, which addressed these barriers to tribal governance over drinking water, and for the first time will enable tribes to be able to access groundwater resources on their own lands for drinking water and allow the EPA regulatory primacy over drinking water on tribal lands in Maine. Now, after decades of fighting for the basic right to clean water, the tribal government is finally on a path to exercise self-determination to address this crisis. So we've kind of talked about this tribal drinking water data gap that we've identified, but the key here is really that federal data sets are responsive to federal priorities and not tribal priorities, but that tribal data sovereignty can offer a framework for developing better tribal drinking water data and asserting self-determination to address drinking water access issues. Limitations in the data mean that the problem is poorly defined and it's difficult to develop meaningful solutions. This is kind of an illustration of what this looks like. Basically, when researchers and federal agencies aren't considering the specifics of drinking water implementation on tribal lands, complex data gets even more confusing. Data sets lack clear definitions and descriptions of limitations. Researchers are drawing conclusions using convenient national data sets, and policy is built on data and research that only tells a part of the story. Policies don't serve tribal needs, and data, tools, and research don't necessarily reflect tribal priorities or the questions tribes want to answer. And I just want to highlight this a little bit more. I think I pulled in this quote from a paper where some researchers were researching Arizona groundwater. And in a state where there are 22 tribes, they excluded all tribal groundwater monitoring data because they didn't want to go through tribal approval processes. They say, quote, "Unfortunately, while water quality information exists for some of these nations, for many, if the data exists, it requires strict approval by the various tribal governments to publish them in a public location." What's not being said here is that the researchers just thought it was too hard to go through tribal approval processes. Tribes increasingly have these approval processes to make collaboration and appropriate research easier. It's offensive to exclude tribes from your research, and it also leads to bad research. I just want to highlight as well that we see this exclusion of tribal data across the drinking water landscape, and that's really the point of this project. Even EPA's surface area boundaries data set didn't capture tribal data at all in building the data set because of the recognition that tribal drinking water, or that the dissemination and delivery of drinking water on tribal lands can be really difficult to model, and especially because systems tend to be rural and because of the jurisdictional complexities. But that's really all the more reason to start with tribal data. Tribal citizens have some of the worst drinking water access. As we said before, it's nearly 50% of tribal homes on tribal lands lack access to reliable water sources, compared to 1% of US homes overall. Our call to agency staff and to researchers is that you have a moral imperative to learn about these issues and to spend the time that's needed to collaborate with and appropriately include tribes in your work. So, where do we go from here? We've identified two kind of pathways to leverage data into better policy. The first is that by bridging the gap, tribes can be better equipped to make decisions based on data that reflects their needs. And the second is that data users can be educated about the limitations of publicly available drinking water, federal data with respect to tribal drinking water. So here's why we need to do this. Tribes deserve access to high quality drinking water. Tribes deserve and need access to high quality data and the same tools that are being provided to other communities. And we're missing opportunities to link water systems and build them out. And if we have good data, we can identify these opportunities and use them to fill these gaps. So in our report, which just launched today, we kind of lay out actions and tools. We lay out key actions to bridge the data gap and key actions to build knowledge. And with each action, we provided a toolkit of reports, exemplar projects, recommendations, and frameworks that can support the implementation of these actions. So this includes building data sets and tools that meet tribal priorities, linking IHS and EPA data sets for tribally led research, link IHS and EPA data collection efforts, improving IHS processes to improve the STARS database, considering a new EPA CIDWIS typology. And then in terms of building knowledge, we've created a couple of resources to educate data users and build a shared vocabulary. And we also have provided recommendations for improving data limitation descriptions, particularly on EPA's site, which we are happy to share that they have begun implementing some of these. So that's very exciting. But this is really, I know I've just in about 20 minutes summarized the year's worth of work, and it might feel unsatisfying, but this is really an invitation to go explore these resources and all of this research that we've done. So if you're interested in learning more, you can check out the website, and I think one of my colleagues will be dropping that in the chat. But it is the EPIC website, Tribal Drinking Water State of the Data webpage. And I think we can get into questions. And I'm going to stop sharing. So thank you all for being here and for listening. And I think, Jesse, do we have like a process that we wanted to do for Q&A if folks have questions? I know that was a ton of information, so.
Yeah, feel free to just put your questions in the chat and we can queue them up. So first question for you is, what role do you anticipate EPA or IHS playing in linking their data, or would this happen outside of the federal government?
Yeah, I think EPA and IHS are certainly key partners in this, and it can't happen without them. But I think that given tribal data sovereignty considerations, I think tribes, there are instances that we've heard about where tribes want to share data with EPA that's additional or voluntary data because they want it to be part of data sets or tools, but they can't and don't want to because EPA is unable to guarantee the protection of that data from public records requests. And so I think there are opportunities for EPA and IHS to be key, crucial partners in this, but they might not be the holders of tools or the leaders of the projects. But I think their collaboration is, necessary and really important.
And maybe just to add to that, they do currently extensively collaborate, right? It's not a net new. So there are pieces of the existing collaboration that we know could be improved, and there's still work to be done outside of those two federal agencies.
Yeah, exactly.
Cool. Second question for you is, do you have any recommendations on getting around the data gap that currently exists? I've been finding it very difficult to calculate any meaningful data with what is currently available.
Yeah, we do have some recommendations. I think we later today will be posting a couple of PDFs that are more of guides to how you could use and navigate EPA's kind of data exploration tools in different ways that are not so obvious, that can kind of help expand the world of data that you're able to look at. And I think, and so would definitely encourage you to look at that. And then I think another piece of this project that you might be interested in is Emily, our data scientist, she looked into this is kind of what kicked off the project, is we compared the service area boundaries data set with the Indian country flag and found a lot of water systems that have modeled boundaries that may actually overlap with Indian country, but aren't necessarily flagged. And so I think it's very preliminary data, and we pointed out all these issues with the service area boundaries data set and kind of inaccuracies within that. But it can be a useful model for looking at where there might be gaps and also kind of expanding our understanding there. So I would encourage you to look at both of those when they're up.
Next question for you is, how have federal cuts impacted progress on this work? Particularly worried about EPA and IHS being gutted.
Yeah. This project started before the November election. And so I think it pivoted a little bit. I think we're waiting to see the appropriations bills and how they kind of shake out this summer. I know EPA already has some initiatives going that are working on really modernizing their systems and their typology. And so hopefully that work will be able to continue, though I know funding is being proposed to be cut. And I'm hoping, IHS is fulfilling a legal responsibility, the trust responsibility of tribes, that funding really shouldn't be cut, especially because it's already been so underfunded. So I think tribes are working really hard to ensure that IHS maintains kind of a good level of funding. And others might be able to speak more to that.
I think one of the things I can add anecdotally is that we do know that the Secretary of Health and Human Services, Robert Kennedy Jr., does care about tribes, and IHS has still been able to hire engineers and is hiring engineers to work on water and sanitation projects across tribal lands, but to be determined and how that actually plays out over the next couple of years. And I think this is a good place for advocacy, again, as Sydney was saying, to speak to the importance of this work going forward. But welcome any of folks that are on. Don't want to put you on the spot, but I do know we have some EPA and IHS colleagues on the line. If there's anything that you might add or any resources that you want to point folks to with respect to EPA and IHS working on this in particular. And so go to the next question. How might we, tribal service organizations, appropriately and legally maneuver those federal jurisdictions and restrictions placed upon our tribal communities and their data?
Yeah, so when you say restrictions, I'm not sure if you're talking about like kind of confidentiality restrictions or like other, like resource limitations, confidentiality. Okay, gotcha. Thank you. And access. Gotcha. Yeah, I think we're working on hopefully developing some sort of pilot project with federal agencies and kind of some regional tribal entities. And I'm really hopeful that those kinds of partnerships can be a model here. And so we include on the website some in some of the toolboxes, actually, like MOUs for data sharing agreements and how other tribes have worked with the federal government to access more data and to improve data validation. And then also how feds and tribes have worked together to share data. And I think that could be a useful piece here because it's really also about ensuring that tribes have consented to the way their data is being used. So we don't want the feds to just go off and create a bunch of new tools that tribes haven't consented to the sharing of their data with, if that makes sense. And so I think there are opportunities to embed like MOAs, MOUs in that process in a safe and consenting way.
Hey, Sydney, I'd like to add, so you can increase your confidentiality and access to data by entering into 638 agreements, and those really help assert sovereignty and tribal jurisdiction, as well as going for treatment as a state so that you can set your own water quality regulations and do those report out. So then you are the data holder. Some food for thought there.
Thank you, Corey. Yeah, that's really important and great points. And right now, Navajo Nation is the only tribe that has drinking water tribal primacy. So, yeah.
Okay. Another one for you. Please expand the connections to workforce development, local labs, and the possibility of data collaborative anchored within tribal colleges and universities.
Oh, that's a great flag. I think, yes, that's great. We will make sure that we talk about TCUs in our recommendations. I'll add that actually, because I didn't include that, and that is like a perfect kind of model collaboration.
Okay, next one. Have you heard discussions about data and statistics being trust or treaty obligations in and of themselves? This is fundamentally a legal question. If they fall under AEGIS, aegis, of trust or treaty obligations, then it gives a stronger argument for why federal investment and attention is not just helpful, but required. This can and should IDS. This was discussed when I was in Interior, including with some tribes, but I think more can be done to investigate this.
Yeah, I mean, that's awesome. If I could, like, I would love to spend so much more time. I think as we did this research, there are so many ways that we could dive in. And I do think that data and statistics and data sharing by the federal government and the provision of data analysis tools and also ending the one-way data highway that we kind of mentioned before are part of trust and treaty obligations. I think that tribes cannot be expected to address drinking water access barriers without, full funding and without this infrastructure, but also without the data. And so that's like a key component of this project is that we would argue that yes, this data and statistics are part of the trust and treaty responsibility. And I think as data becomes like a much more valuable resource, and a lot of really, really smart law professors and data sovereignty researchers have written about this. But if somebody wants to take that work up, like you really should. I think that would be awesome. Yes. Okay. And David Harvey in the chat from IHS has shared the IHS funded construction projects GIS map, which is an awesome platform where you can view wastewater and infrastructure projects that the agency and others have funded, and you can see how far along they are and kind of what's going on with them and where the funding is coming from. I think it's a really cool platform.
Next one is around are there discoveries around data sovereignty that include technical infrastructure, such as data centers and bespoke AI support?
Yeah, I think, so we didn't get into that. That was kind of outside the scope of this project, but I have heard about some of these works. I know that a group of tribes, I'm not going to say where because they didn't okay me sharing this information, but I do know about a group of tribes who are working together to build kind of a data hub where they will store data. It's kind of a collaborative effort to have like increased data protections, but also to make it easier to collaborate with researchers and to do different data sharing work. So I think folks are definitely thinking about that and are thinking about where we store this data and how it gets stored. There was a great article a few months ago that I can try to dig up, but I don't know.
Yeah, I'll add there's a separate project that we're working on at Epic that is focused specifically on AI and opportunities and impacts within environmental conservation and movements. And we were also just at the National Association of NACO, National Association of Counties. I don't remember what the O stands for, where there were resolutions passed specifically on providing more local access to, or not local access, but local decision making around where data centers are sited. And I think that there's a lot of opportunity both on tribal lands and at the local level for more authority in terms of where and how they're occurring. So more on the AI and data centers front, probably later this year, but wasn't part of this project.
Mm-hmm. And then Paula, I see your question in the chat about ACEs. I think that's actually great. I didn't even think about presenting at ACEs. I am sort of in a new job. I'm in a fellowship at Epic, and I just 2 weeks ago started a new role. But I will think about it, look into it, etc. And then Jacob, also agree about your M opinion comment. I think that would be a great thing to look into. So noted. And also for everybody else on the call, please note that. And then I see a question about the use of AI to improve and restrict data collection, accuracy, and sharing. I am not equipped at all to answer that. AI was not part of my research. I have my own personal opinions on AI that I will not share here. And I'm not going to touch this one. I'm sorry.
Patrick, I see you raised your hand. Let me see if I can figure out if I can have you come off mute. Yeah,
Hi,
go.
Patrick.
Hey, Sydney, and thank you all for the presentation today. It's very insightful. Always really good work. So I have a question I'm not entirely sure how to ask. So recently working with another tribal kind of data initiative, was made aware of a concept known as a data predator. And so this would be a institution or an individual that is really interested in working with tribes and tribal communities and may often come to the table with really great tools or services, but at the end of the day is really trying to extract a lot of critical tribal data. And so my question, I think, for you is, what can tribes do to more than just protect themselves in terms of security, but kind of like understand who could be a trusted partner when dealing with these, especially these large and critical data sets? Oh,
Yeah, Patrick, thank you for that question. Could you actually repeat the name of they're called data? What's the word?
yeah, I'd never heard it called this before, but a colleague had called it a data predator.
Data predator. Okay, thank you. Yeah, I mean, yeah. So I've not heard of that, but I mean, it kind of makes sense. I think let's see, how should I say this? There's a lot of money that's come into Indian country in the past few years, and I think a lot of folks popped up in kind of interesting ways, and a lot of interest in Indian country kind of came about outside of Indian country. And I think even like there are small things that I've seen where tribes like one reason that it's so important to be doing this work and this data work in particular is tribes who don't have GIS staff capacity or data analysis staff capacity basically can't do it unless they're contracting out with some contractor who can do this data analysis for them. And so that puts them in a position of anytime they want to present to tribal leadership to make a decision about drinking water planning or something, they have to go to this contractor and say, can you add a layer to this map? Or can you make us a table that shows these numbers? And then they have to pay them more money. And then there are also situations where the contract, wasn't checked thoroughly, and the contract allows the random contractor to kind of own this tribal data, which is like obviously extraordinarily inappropriate. And so it kind of sounds like that, but on a worse scale because it's coming in with different intentions. They're not a contractor, they're somebody saying that they want to do this work. And I don't really know what to say about it, but I think there's definitely room to make sure folks are aware and educated and know who is a good partner. I think someone pointed out TCUs earlier, tribal colleges and universities. Tribal colleges and universities are a great partner in this work. Tribal epidemiology centers. We have highlighted some good potential kind of tribal connector partners in our toolboxes. And so hopefully that could be helpful. But I don't think anything we've done specifically addresses this. But if other folks have things, I see some stuff in the chat. Yep, Corey's sharing about a tribal data sovereignty policy in the chat. And I've seen really awesome tribal laws and codes about tribal data sovereignty. I think Bad River Menominee has a really nice one that I was reading recently that you could read online. Their tribal code about data sovereignty is great. So yeah, free tools and open platforms, be cautious of. Yeah, thank you, Corey.
Yeah, those are scary, especially in public webinars. They usually report that. So if you're speaking or presenting, you really want to make sure that what you're saying is okay to share. And yes, NDAs are excellent. As a deputy executive director at the Yurok tribe, all of our MOUs and outside agreements or even consensual agreements like drinking water, trying to think of like what they're called, anything for digging when the TIPOs are out there, any type of permitting, there's a sovereignty clause and specific to data. And so having those things just ready to go in all of your contracts really gives you teeth in the law, especially for tribal jurisdictions that are checkered, because you can actually hold a non-tribal member accountable through those consensual agreements. So just flagging that, you can even go sovereign to sovereign if you need to in litigation.
Thank you, Corey. Well, I think we're about at time, unless there's any last questions. Oh yeah, Jacob.
Hey, thank you. Just on this is a really interesting challenge that was raised about the data predators. And thinking about the legal tools like what you were mentioning, Corey, I was also wondering, is there some way to use like the concept of web of trust, like where PGP keys are used to one person trust one person because they've worked with, for example, a tribe and they've shown to respect the sovereignty of the tribe. And basically you build in a human element in addition to any sort of legal elements. It makes it a little bit of a social exercise, which ultimately we need. I need to stop talking now because I'm going to go down an AI screed that maybe is going to land similar to where Sydney was going to not go about the human element. But it makes me wonder if there's a way to include some sort of web of trust building type approach that could help complement and bring people to the table. But thank you all very much for this really great presentation. I look forward to reading the results of the work.
Awesome. Thank you for that. Yeah, also a great flag. I think I'm glad we're getting all of this captured in this recording, hopefully, because I think these are some really great thoughts and also some great avenues for work. So hoping to push forward some collaborations. Hopefully other folks will start doing some collaboration result of this project and a result of other projects. So excited to kind of think together on these things. Awesome. Well, I know Jesse relinked the report on the website here. And just a couple more resources are coming today, finishing up some PDFs. So really excited to have this work out there. Please share it. If you have questions, you can reach out to any of us. Happy to chat more about this. And also, if you see things that are missing that would fit really well into any of our toolboxes, recommendations, please let us know. I think we just made a note to add the DSFC map that David shared. I think that's a great resource. So thank you all. Nos